What if the silence you fear the most is not absence, but invitation? What if the quiet moments where God seems distant are not voids to be filled with noise, but sacred spaces where trust is born? Before the answer comes, before the breakthrough arrives, and before the path is clear, there is a voice, not loud but steady, saying, "Trust me, stay silent." When we speak of God's silence, we often feel unease. Silence, to many of us, feels like absence. We are conditioned to associate communication with love, noise with presence, and speech with involvement. So when God is silent, our immediate fear is that He has withdrawn, that perhaps He has forgotten us, or worse, turned away. But this reaction reveals more about our limitations than about God's nature. Divine silence is not divine absence. In fact, the silence of God can be one of the most profound proofs of His nearness, not His distance. Consider a teacher during a test. When a student is struggling through a difficult examination, the teacher does not speak. The silence is not because the teacher has abandoned the student, but because the moment is meant to measure something within the student, not the teacher. In this same way, when God is silent, it is not because He has left us to flounder alone, but because He is allowing space for growth. It is in these moments that our character is revealed and refined. Silence tests the depth of our faith, the strength of our trust, and the sincerity of our devotion. Silence can also be a form of divine restraint. If God were to answer every question the moment it was asked, or resolve every tension as soon as it emerged, we would never learn to endure, to persevere, or to lean on Him when understanding fails. We would remain spiritual infants, needy, impatient, and dependent not on His presence, but on His performance. Silence protects us from this shallowness. It pushes us beyond mere emotional dependence and invites us into mature faith, a faith that says, even if I hear nothing, I still believe. Even when I feel alone, I know I'm not. That kind of faith can only be born in silence. There is also the mystery of divine timing. We often desire immediate comfort, clear direction, or visible signs. But God's work is rarely rushed. He is not bound by time as we are. His silence may be the waiting room before a miracle, the quiet before a breakthrough, or the stillness that prepares us to receive an answer we were not yet ready to understand. What feels like delay is often preparation. What feels like distance is often a hidden nearness, operating beneath the surface of our perception. The problem is not always that God is silent, but that we are too noisy to hear Him. Furthermore, silence does not mean inactivity. We equate sound with action. If something is happening, surely it must make noise. But the deepest, most transformative processes are often silent. Seeds sprout beneath the soil without sound, hearts heal without a whisper, and the soul, too, often grows in silence. God may be working most powerfully when He appears most still. His silence may cloak a divine operation so vast that we would tremble to see it fully revealed. He hides not to punish, but to protect, not to withdraw, but to work in a way that only silence can hold. The silence of God, then, is not a void. It is a space filled with purpose, meaning, and mercy. It is a spiritual landscape where faith is no longer dependent on feeling and where love matures without needing constant affirmation. Silence trains us to walk by faith, not by sight. And in this silence, we are invited to listen more deeply, not with our ears, but with our hearts. The quiet of God is not empty, it is holy. And it is in that holiness that we are invited to trust Him most. Faith does not grow in the loudness of life. It does not flourish in the clamor of constant answers, nor does it mature in the flood of explanations. Faith, true and deep, grows in stillness. In the quiet corners of the soul where noise is absent and restlessness must yield, faith takes root. The human heart, by its nature, seeks clarity. It wants signs, assurances, and visible confirmations. But faith, by its very essence, is not based on what is seen or explained. It is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And for such assurance to be cultivated, there must be space, silent, undisturbed space, for belief to deepen beyond sight and sound. In a world obsessed with immediacy and constant information, silence is uncomfortable. We fear the unknown. We want to be certain, to feel secure. We reach for answers and demand that God speaks when we call. But this posture often leaves no room for trust. Trust grows not from knowing everything, but from knowing enough about the one who holds everything. And to know him in that way, we must allow ourselves to be still. Stillness is not inactivity, it is openness. It is the quiet posture of the soul that says, I do not need to hear right now, I only need to believe. Stillness teaches us patience in a way that nothing else can. When there is nothing to distract us, nothing to entertain us, and nothing to explain our confusion away, we are left alone with God and ourselves. In that sacred solitude, we are confronted with our fears, our doubts, and our insufficiency. And this is the soil in which faith grows, not in the denial of doubt, but in facing it without running. When the noise fades, and all that remains is the silence between our questions and his answers, we begin to discover what we actually believe. Faith matures when we are no longer dependent on emotional highs or external confirmations. In the stillness, we are taught to stop chasing signs and to start resting in the character of God. It is there that faith stops being a reaction and starts becoming a choice, a deliberate, often painful, but holy choice to say, even in silence, I trust you. That choice, repeated in silence, becomes the anchor of our soul. It is easy to believe when God speaks loudly. It is altogether different and more powerful to believe when he does not speak at all. Stillness also strips us of our pride. In our own strength, we rush to fix, to analyze, to do something. But stillness demands surrender. It calls us to stop fixing and start trusting. And in that surrender, faith grows. Not because it is rewarded with answers, but because it finds peace without them. Stillness teaches that faith is not about getting what we want, but about resting in who God is. It does not deny the storm. It rests in the one who sleeps in the boat. Faith that grows in stillness is stronger than the kind born in noise. It is not swayed by every wind of doubt or fear. It has been tested in the silence where no answers came, yet belief remained. It has learned to wait, not with anxiety, but with expectation. It knows that God's silence is not his absence, and his delay is not his denial. Faith that grows in stillness has nothing to prove and nothing to demand. It is content with being grounded in the quiet confidence that God is who he says he is, even when he says nothing at all. Human understanding is inherently limited. No matter how vast our intellect, how deep our education, or how wide our experiences, we remain creatures bound by time, space, and perception. We see life through narrow windows, interpret events through our own assumptions, and often demand explanations from a God who operates beyond the boundaries we can even comprehend. It is this limitation that often makes us restless in silence. We want to know why something is happening, when it will end, or what purpose it serves. And when answers do not come, we assume that God is either ignoring us or failing to act. But in truth, the issue lies not in his silence, but in our inability to grasp his perspective. Our minds are finite. His wisdom is infinite. We live one moment at a time. He sees the entire timeline of existence at once. What we call confusion, he calls process. What we call delay, he calls preparation. When we face suffering, uncertainty, or prolonged silence, we often view these moments as pointless or even cruel. But our judgments are formed from a limited vantage point. It's like standing too close to a painting, so close that we only see a blotch of color and cannot appreciate the masterpiece. God, however, sees the whole canvas. He sees how the shadows contribute to the beauty of the whole image. He sees how a single moment of silence fits into a larger story of redemption and growth. Demanding answers from God can often be like a child demanding to understand the reasoning behind every decision a parent makes. The parent in love may not always explain, not because they wish to keep the child in ignorance, but because the explanation would either confuse or burden the child unnecessarily. Likewise, there are things in life that God could explain to us, but we would not yet be able to understand or carry. Sometimes his silence is not rejection, but mercy, a mercy that shields us from truths too heavy for the present moment. We also have the tendency to assume that knowledge guarantees peace. If only we knew why something was happening, we think we would accept it more easily. But that is not always true. There are times when even the knowledge of a reason would not remove the sting of pain or lessen the weight of waiting. Peace does not come from having all the answers. It comes from knowing and trusting the one who does. This is why silence can be so formative, because it forces us to lean not on our understanding, but on his character. Human pride resists this. We don't like to admit that our minds have limits. We prefer logic, control, and predictability. When life breaks out of those patterns, we are shaken. But faith begins where understanding ends. It doesn't mean we stop thinking or questioning. It means that we acknowledge a greater wisdom beyond our own, one that we may not fully grasp in this life. Trusting God in silence requires the humility to say, I don't understand this, but I trust that you do. That is not weakness, it is strength, rooted in reverence. The scripture itself acknowledges this divide. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, says the Lord. This is not a rebuke, but an invitation to let go of the illusion that we must know everything to believe, to accept that mystery is part of the walk of faith. God's ways are higher, not just in scale, but in nature. We are not always meant to understand in the moment, but we are always invited to trust in the one who understands all things. Silence can be one of the most difficult commands to obey. When faced with pain, injustice, confusion, or delay, our instinct is to react. We want to speak, to argue, to explain ourselves, to demand answers. Yet there are times when God's message to the soul is simple and firm. Stay silent, not because he wants to suppress us, but because silence itself can be obedience. It is a chosen posture of surrender, a deliberate act of trust that says, I will not act until you lead. I will not speak until you command. This kind of silence is not passive, it is not weakness or fear. It is a deeply active submission of the will. To remain silent when every part of you wants to respond is an act of strength, not of retreat. It takes courage to be still when others move, to remain quiet when others speak, and to wait when everything inside urges you to do something. Obedient silence is not the absence of voice, it is the presence of faith. It is choosing not to fill the air with complaints, defenses, or anxious speculation, because your trust in God outweighs your need to control the situation. There are moments in life where speaking might only worsen things. When words are spoken in haste, fear, or anger, they can leave wounds and cause confusion. Silence, however, allows space for clarity, healing, and divine intervention. When we stay silent out of obedience to God, we are essentially stepping aside and allowing Him to be the one who speaks, acts, and defends. This is not easy. We are taught to fight for our rights, to explain ourselves, to ensure we are not misunderstood, but sometimes God calls us to let go of that need for justification and to let Him be the one who vindicates. The discipline of silence can also refine the soul. It quiets the noise of ego, pride, and impulse. It teaches humility. It draws attention inward, where God often speaks in ways that are drowned out by outward noise. In the silence of obedience, we learn to hear the whispers of God's direction. We sense His timing more clearly, and we are formed into people who respond, not from instinct, but from wisdom. It is in this kind of silence that the soul begins to listen more than it speaks, and in listening, it becomes more aligned with God's purposes. Obedient silence also demonstrates confidence in God's sovereignty. It says, "I don't need to defend myself because I believe you are my defender." It says, "I don't need to act right now because I trust that you are already at work." It is a declaration of trust, spoken not with words, but with stillness. This does not mean we are to remain silent in the face of injustice or avoid speaking truth when it is required. But there are times, clearly marked by the Spirit, where God's will is not for us to act or speak, but to wait, to remain quiet, not out of helplessness, but out of reverence. In these moments, silence becomes worship. It is a sacrifice of our will, our voice, and our need for control. It is laying down our right to be heard in order to honor His voice above all. This kind of silence is rare and costly, but it is also powerful. It trains us to let God lead, to let God speak first, to let God move before we do. It reminds us that obedience is not always about doing more, but sometimes about doing less, so that He may do more than we could ever imagine. There is a kind of trust that does not require words. It does not demand daily reassurances or constant affirmations. It simply rests, like a child in the arms of a parent, unconcerned with the details because it knows the one who holds it. This is the kind of trust that grows when we learn to stop striving for control, stop reaching for explanations, and simply abide in the quiet presence of God. It is not born overnight. It is formed through time, through testing, and through seasons where God's voice is faint or altogether silent. In those moments, when we feel most abandoned, we are often being invited to the deepest intimacy with Him. Stillness with God is not a passive state. It is a chosen dwelling, a deliberate settling of the soul into a place where striving ceases. The world will tell us to keep pushing, keep questioning, keep demanding clarity. But God's message is often different. Be still and know that I am God. To abide in stillness is not to give up. It is to give in to a greater strength. It is to stop resisting the silence and to stop believing that within it He is present. Not always in the ways we expect, not always with immediate answers, but always with steadfast love and unwavering faithfulness. This kind of stillness teaches the heart to listen differently. When we stop speaking, stop analyzing, stop pleading, something shifts. We begin to hear things we had previously missed. A sense of peace begins to emerge, not because the circumstances have changed, but because we are no longer trying to manage them alone. Trust grows in the stillness because we begin to let God be God. We stop trying to help Him solve our problem. We stop trying to write the story ourselves. We learn to sit beside Him, not as advisors, but as children who believe that the Father knows what He is doing. In stillness, we surrender the need to understand everything, and it is in that surrender that we often find the greatest clarity. The situation may remain the same, but the storm within us begins to quiet. We stop fighting against the unknown and instead rest in the known, that God is good, that He is wise, and that He is working even when we cannot see it. Trusting in silence is not a sign of spiritual dullness, but of spiritual maturity. It is a mark of someone who has walked through valleys and found God to be faithful, even when His voice was distant. There is also a deep form of worship in simply abiding. When we choose to remain with God without needing Him to constantly perform or speak, we express a love that is not conditional. We are not following Him only because of what He gives or says. We are choosing Him for who He is. This kind of relationship is the foundation of unshakable faith. It is not built on dramatic moments, but on quiet fidelity, on 1,000 silent yeses whispered in the dark. Learning to abide in stillness also reveals our idols. It shows us how much we rely on noise, on activity, on approval, on understanding. And when all of that is stripped away, we face the question, is God enough for me? If He says nothing today, will I still walk with Him? If He changes nothing this week, will I still love Him? These are the questions that are answered not by loud declarations, but by the quiet decision to remain. To sit with God in the stillness without needing explanations is to trust Him not only with the future, but with the silence itself. It is to say, your presence is enough. I don't need words. I need you. And in that posture, trust becomes something deeper than feeling. It becomes a steady foundation that does not move when everything else does. The idea that God is working even when we cannot see or hear Him is one of the most comforting and yet challenging truths of faith. We are trained by life to associate action with visibility. We trust what we can measure, hear, touch, or understand. But the spiritual life is not built on visible proofs. It is built on trust in the unseen. When God is silent, it is not a sign of inactivity. His silence often cloaks some of His most profound work, the kind of work that transforms the heart, aligns events, and weaves together outcomes we could never construct on our own. To trust in this hidden activity is to walk by faith, not by sight. The soil does not see the seed grow. It does not feel the stem break through the shell beneath its surface. Yet, even in the stillness, even in the dark, something is happening. In much the same way, we may not perceive what God is doing in a given season, but that does not mean He is doing nothing. He works in quiet ways, beneath the surface of our understanding, behind the veil of time. What looks like delay is often divine preparation. What feels like absence may actually be the stage for something greater than we could ask or imagine. We tend to interpret silence as neglect, but divine silence is often a signal of deep engagement. God does not need to announce every movement. He does not owe us daily briefings. He is not required to share His process to prove His presence. He works with a wisdom that is not hurried and a purpose that is not fragile. The silence of God is not the stillness of inactivity. It is the pause of a master artist adding the final strokes to a masterpiece that must be revealed in the right light at the right time. Trusting God in this way stretches the soul. It demands that we live without full explanations. It invites us to relinquish our need for control and instead focus on God's character. His history of faithfulness becomes our reassurance. We remember what He has done before. We hold on to His promises, not because we see the results right now, but because we know the one who made them. In the silence, our focus shifts from outcomes to the one who orchestrates them. This quiet trust refines our desires. It clarifies what truly matters. When we cannot hear God's voice or see His hand, we are stripped of distractions. We are drawn to the heart of faith, relationship, not results. Do we trust God because He gives us what we want, or because we believe He is good even when He doesn't? Silence tests our answer. It reveals whether we follow Him for who He is or merely for what He does. And in this test, we grow. We become less like anxious children needing constant affirmation, and more like mature sons and daughters, resting in their Father's love. God's silence is not punishment. It is often a mercy. It gives us space to wrestle, to surrender, to grow. It allows time for others to move into place, for circumstances to ripen, for our hearts to become ready. When the answer finally comes, it is not rushed or incomplete. It is perfect, shaped by wisdom we cannot always trace. And when we look back, we often find that the silence was not empty at all. It was full of hidden grace. To live in the reality of God's quiet work is to live with expectancy rather than fear. It is to believe that He is moving even now, rearranging what needs to be shifted, healing what must be healed, preparing what will soon be revealed. It is to stand in the silence and say, I know You're here. I trust what You're doing, even if I don't yet see it. That is the faith that holds firm even when heaven is quiet. And so, the message is clear, not shouted, but whispered to the heart that dares to listen. Trust me, stay silent. It is not a command rooted in distance or indifference, but in divine wisdom and perfect love. When we surrender our demand for answers, when we embrace the limits of our understanding, when we choose stillness over striving and silence over self-defense, we step into a deeper relationship with the One who sees all, knows all, and never stops working, even when He appears silent. Faith does not always need a voice. Sometimes it simply needs a quiet heart that says, even here, even now, I trust You.